Good afternoon. Welcome to the fourth session of the Great Lakes Traditional Ecological Knowledge Speaker Series. Today's session is titled TEK Guided Research to Address Community-Based Chemical Concerns. We like to begin each of the sessions with inviting participants to share in the chat which Indigenous lands and territories you are participating from today. So please feel free to begin sharing in the chat now so we can acknowledge all of the Indigenous lands and territories. And please be sure to check all panelists and attendees. Want to see Juani, Anishinaabe Kwe, Naganiko Kwe, Jinikas, Zigon Kwe, Jinikas, Nikigindo Dem, Wikwedang, and Dunjaba. Hello, my name is Jessica Koski. I am Anishinaabe from the Keweenaw Indian community, which is located in Michigan's Upper Peninsula on the south shore of Lake Superior. I'm participating today from Dakota Homelands in Minnesota, where I currently serve as a regional biologist and program manager for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA, Midwest region. I'm also an incoming doctoral student at the University of British Columbia's Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability. In my current role with the BIA, I serve as the U.S. co-lead for the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement Annex 10 Science TEK Task Team. The TEK Speaker Series is presented by Annex 10 of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement in partnership with the University of Minnesota Twin Cities Department of American Indian Studies. The series is co-organized by myself, Andrew Preston, who serves as the Canadian co-lead for the TEK Task Team, and TEK Task Team US Caucus member Jessica Dolan, who is a co-organizer and also supporting Q&A behind the scenes for today's session. Jessica is an ethnobotanist on contract with the St. Regis Mohawk tribe in Akwesasne, and she also serves as a member of the Conservation Through Reconciliation team based at the University of Ontario. The Great Lakes TEK Speaker Series seeks to share lessons across Indigenous communities and increase awareness of the value of Indigenous knowledge and how to appropriately bridge knowledge systems. We are astounded by the level of interest in the Speaker Series, which currently has over 700 attendees registered, including participants from tribal, First Nation, and Métis communities, as well as numerous federal agency participants from both the US and Canadian governments, many state and provincial agencies, as well as academic and K-12 attendees. So at this time, I will pass it to my co-lead partner, Andrew Preston, to introduce himself and provide an overview and the logistics for today's session.
Hello, and welcome back to everyone who has been to a previous session. And if this is your first session, we're very glad that you've joined. So welcome. My name is Andrew Preston. I'm a senior policy analyst with Environment and Climate Change Canada, and as Jessica mentioned, co-lead of the Great Lakes Water Quality Annex 10 or Science Annex TEK Task Team. I'm speaking to you from where I live on Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory, not far from where the Don River enters Lake Ontario. As I've mentioned in previous sessions, the land I live and work on is Dish with One Spoon territory, land that is meant to be peaceably shared so that all are provided for. This land is also covered by Treaty 13, an agreement between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit River signed over 2 centuries ago. This treaty made it possible for settlers to come and live here in the first place. It has also established the responsibilities that newcomers have to the Mississaugas of the Credit and to the land and to the water to be good treaty partners and to support all people's efforts to live a good life. Before getting started with today's program, I'd like to go over some housekeeping items. First, in terms of how the session will unfold today, there'll be 2 presentations, after which we will move into the question and answer portion of the program. And that will last about 25 minutes. Everyone attending has been placed on mute for the session, so to pose your questions, we would like you to use Zoom's Q&A function. You should see the button for that at the bottom of your screen. We will be collecting questions as they're posed throughout the presentations, and we'll return to them during the Q&A portion. So please go ahead and submit all of your questions as you think of them rather than waiting for the Q&A segment to begin. And if you want to share other information with the larger group, please use the chat function. If you're posting to the larger group, take care to ensure that you address your note to all participants. Finally, I'd like to introduce the moderator for today's session, Michael Dockery. Mike is a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation with traditional territories around southern Lake Michigan. He's an assistant professor for tribal natural resource management in the Forest Resources Department at the University of Minnesota, as well as an affiliate faculty member in the American Indian Studies Department there. And we are very fortunate to have Mike with us today. So with that, I'll pass the microphone over to Mike.
Great, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Bozo, everybody. I'm Mike Dockery and really excited to be here today. I'll just reiterate, if you're putting your notes in the chat, there's a little blue button right above where you type. And if you wanted to go to everybody, select panelists and attendees. I see a few introductions going just to us, which is great to see. And it's always humbling to see people coming in from all across this wide area of Canada and the United States and all of our Indigenous territories. So I'm going to introduce, we have 5 speakers today. We'll have kind of separated into 2 sessions with some main speakers and then a group of panelists, I guess, for lack of a better term. And so I'm just going to jump right into it because it's really exciting to see all the people we have today. So our first presenter will be Val Ganyu, and she serves as the Director for University Indigenous Community Partnerships at Michigan Tech's Great Lakes Research Center and a Research Assistant Professor for the College of Forest Resources and Environmental Science. Ganyu's interdisciplinary expertise in environmental policy, food sovereignty, and community-engaged research focuses on the socio-cultural impacts of legacy toxic compounds, particularly on the relationships within fishing communities. Her research, teaching, and service center on evaluating Indigenous peoples and knowledge, facilitating equitable research practice and design, and guiding partnerships that prioritize the protection and restoration of life and land in the Great Lakes region. The next panelist for this first group is Evelyn Ravindran. She's an enrolled member of the Keweenaw Indian community and serves as the Director of Natural Resources for the Keweenaw Indian community. In working for the tribe for more than 3 decades, she has served in many capacities for the protection of treaty resources and revitalization of food sovereignty. Her main priorities are to share Keweenaw Indian community stewardship and governance practices for the Lake Superior Basin communities and work in partnership with others for the restoration and protection of relationships between water, air, fisheries, and forests, and many other plant and wildlife communities. The next person on this panel is Seth Moore. Seth has worked for the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior Chippewa since 2005 and manages the Grand Portage Department of Biology and Environment. He has worked on Great Lakes fisheries, wildlife, and environmental issues for over 29 years. Dr. Moore received the 2013 Tribal Biologist of the Year Award from the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society. And earned his PhD in water resources science and a master's degree in environmental biology from the University of Minnesota. And he has a bachelor's dual degree in biology and environmental studies from Northland College in Ashland, Wisconsin. Dr. Moore led the development and implementation of the Grand Portage Climate Change Adaptation Plan to address projected impacts to the reservation lands and waters. And more recently, he's working in collaboration with the University of Minnesota, US EPA, and the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency as he has undertaken studies to determine concentrations of chemicals of emerging concern in subsistence species of fish, along with sediments and waters of inland lakes and Lake Superior. Then our second group begins with Heather Patterson. And Heather Patterson is a graduate student at the University of Guelph under the supervision of Dr. Jesse Popp. Her studies focus on the environment and sociocultural impacts of herbicide use in commercial forestry and methods of weaving ways of knowing. The project began and continues to be an Indigenous-led initiative in partnership with several First Nations across northeastern Ontario, Canada. Her presentation today focuses on the results from a knowledge-sharing workshop entitled Guardians in a Changing World and the impacts of glycophosphate-based herbicides on forest ecosystems and the people who rely on them. And the next presenter, the last person I will introduce now before beginning, is J.C. Chiblo. J.C. Chiblo is an Anishinaabe from Garden River First Nation, Ontario. She has an undergraduate degree in biology and a master's of environmental studies. J.C.'s J.C.'s master's research was conducted in her community, where she brought together youth, community leaders, and knowledge keepers in a workshop style gathering focused on climate action through an Indigenous food sovereignty approach. Currently, JC works as the toolkit training lead with Indigenous climate action and as a research assistant with the Indigenous Environmental Justice Project. Thank you to all of you for being here, and I will turn it over now to Val Gagnon. Val?
Thank you for that introduction. So before I turn off my camera, I just want to say good afternoon to everyone and also begin our talk in a good way by first acknowledging that my own institution, Michigan TEK, is centrally located within the 1842 Treaty with the Chippewa Ceded Territory, which means that we share our lands and waters and our responsibilities with many Ojibwa nations throughout this region. And I also want to acknowledge our many more than human relatives, the fish and wildlife and food and medicines, plants, trees, and among the water, winds, rocks, and soils, that this region is also their home and has been since time immemorial. And so thank you for inviting us to share more about bridging knowledge systems and expertise for understanding the dynamics of a contaminated tribal landscape system. My name is Val Gagnon, and thank you, Mike, for that wonderful introduction. And I live, work, and study here at Michigan Tech's Great Lakes Research Center. I'm also going to have Evelyn introduce herself. Evelyn?
Anine, thank you, Mike, for the introduction as well. And I will turn it over to Seth now.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, thanks, Mike, for the introduction. My name is Seth Moore. I am the Director of Biology and Environment for the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa.
So for our talk today, I'm going to first spend a little bit of time explaining what we mean by bridging knowledge systems and expertise. I think it's really important to start out by unpacking what we mean when we use these terms here. And next, I'll describe our fish foundations. So some of the beginnings of our partnership, specifically between Keweenaw Bay and Michigan Tech. And this will be followed by an overview of some of the current research landscape focused on community-based chemical concerns. And then I'll spend a little bit more time focusing on one project in particular, the Socio-Ecological Systems Research Project by the Keweenaw Bay Indian community. And in closing, I'm actually going to leave you with a prelude. I believe that the moments that we are in today are really an introduction to important science, governance, and education transformations in our future. So before we get started, I wanted to share just a couple important things about who I am and how I have come to know about Keweenaw Bay research partnerships that I'm going to share with you today. And first, I was born an ocean away, actually. I was born in Seoul, South Korea, and brought over as a young child and raised in the United States. I have more recently started to learn about more of my own personal heritage, and I'm definitely still learning how to be Korean. And second, I want everyone to know that most of my understandings are very place-based. My knowledge is connected to the stories in Keweenaw Bay. And I know that other tribal nations have different relationships to their homelands and different stories, different agreements with other governments. And I also know that treaty agreements in Canada are different from those here in the United States. So first, I will explain what I mean by bridging. And many times I and Evelyn often talk about the work that we do as being in a space between. And so I use the concept of a bridge to describe Ermine's theoretical model, the ethical space of engagement. And I've added 4 into the quote, and this is to illustrate that bridging is more than just a theory, but it's also a practice. So Ermine explains here in this quote that ethical space is a framework for guiding respectful interaction across cultural differences in a way that upholds the fundamental integrity of all knowledge systems entering that space. And Ermine's thinking was really informed by Robert Poole's work on deep subjectivity, described as working in the space between 2 knowledge systems, a space that no one owns, where engagement involves openness and mutual learning. And like a number of Indigenous scholars and those who do Indigenous scholarship, I use the ethical space of engagement to describe the work between Western and Indigenous sciences. And I think of the bridge as a place for the co-construction of knowledge, where everyone has and brings their own research toolbox. So the bridge brings people together with different philosophies, including community members and professionals, different disciplines from different institutions. And also building the bridge and maintaining the bridge requires different intellects and different methods and approaches and various skills and expertise. Really, the more the better. So doing this work together allows for the development of shared expectations and vocabularies together, a place where you can create shared visions and goals, and also the creation of ethics in common for joint action and justice. It is true that Western and Indigenous sciences have different philosophies and values, but it's also true that each has unique strengths that can be complementary to one another, which also strengthens knowledge and understanding of our own knowledge systems and each other's. And so, for example, Western science, which has been, a lot of this has been shared from the teachings by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Western science has a gift of seeing and learning about structures and processes and different interactions, and really thinking about generalizing knowledge across space and time, where Indigenous science has a gift of listening and learning from structures, processes, and interactions, and thinking about particularizing knowledge rooted to place and seasons. Western science has really enhanced our attention and our abilities to see when you think about particularly the physical materials and cognitive intellect think about ways of seeing and what we've learned from the microscope to the telescope, and even through the development of different models and modeling complex systems across space and time. And indigenous science has enhanced our attention and abilities to listen, particularly to relational and emotional intellect, intuitive ways of knowing, thinking about ways of listening and what we have learned from other beings about how to be human and support others' autonomy, and really thinking about decentering the human experience. And so in summary, bridging knowledge systems and expertise, it's important to recognize that the bridge is not a divider, but it's a pathway. And this bridge isn't for consultation, but for interaction. And the space is not intended to be confrontational, but a place to cooperate. And knowledge systems aren't posed as in opposition of one another, but complementary. And this is in a place to integrate all of our differences, but also to maintain the integrity of unique systems. And finally, just to re-emphasize, this is not just a theory, but it's also intended in practice. And so moving to our fish foundations, when we're thinking about our partnership between Keweenaw Bay and Michigan Tech, and our research foundations are really centered from our work on fish risk and health within the Keweenaw Bay Indian community, and also the many legal and institutional frameworks and their decision-making processes that really affect these relationships. And so for more than 50 years, fish consumption has remained the primary route of human exposure to a variety of toxic substances, such as mercury, PCBs, and dioxins, just to name a few. And so today, nationally, we have more than 5,000 fish consumption advisories, and more than half of these advisories are within the Great Lakes region. And this is incredibly problematic, considering that the Great Lakes public consumes more than 2 times the fish than the average American. And tribal nations consume up to 13 times more, and sometimes more than that. And these levels can correspond to exposure levels that are well above safety standards. Now, as a graduate student, I served as a research assistant on an NSF CNH project that was concerned with the global movement and the uneven distribution of toxic substances. And this process is really greatly affected by climate-related changes. And once emitted, these toxic compounds are incredibly persistent. They continually undergo a cycle of depositing and accumulating in the land, water, and fish. They can re-emit into the atmosphere and continue to redeposit at higher latitudes. And climate change is perpetuating increased emissions and re-emission processes. And much of this is attributed to the global increase in wildfires and rising temperatures. And this is causing an increase in deposition rates to the Great Lakes region. And at the time, my work intersected across 4 universities, 12 federal and tribal government agencies, and numerous researchers from many different disciplines. I was part of a team that was responsible for guiding relationships and communication between the investigators and our research partners. And really, it was about ensuring that our research was responsive to and also respectful of our partners' priorities. And the project's objectives were to estimate global emissions and forecast spatially accumulations of various toxics based on climate modeling and also based on different scales of policy. So at the beginning of the project, we worked with the community to develop the driving research question, which became, when can we eat the fish? And this schematic here, it shows the steps in the research that were used to investigate the Save Fish timeline. And you can read more about how we ensured that the community directed our work in this Power and Politics article, and also the policy recommendations that we put forth here in this policy brief, eliminating the need for fish consumption advisories in the Great Lakes Basin. So the short answer to when can we eat the fish is it depends. The most influential factors that affect place-based contamination is policy. And policy at every scale greatly matters to all places. So this work provided the foundation to continue to work with Keweenaw Bay on different research priorities. So fish relations, food sovereignty, renewable energy transitions, and also the future of the community, which are youth. But before I share more about this work, we were asked by Grand Portage to highlight a research partnership that centers on chemicals of emerging concern in water, sediment, and subsistence fish used by the tribal nation community. Dr. Seth Moore, who was introduced at the beginning, is a leader in this partnership and will also be a panelist during the Q&A later in this session. So for this research, 28 water bodies in the 1854 ceded territory were sampled for CECs, including Lake Superior near Grand Portage. The three categories of sampled sites were watersheds without development, watersheds with development, and watersheds with wastewater effluent. In these sites, researchers detected 117 of 160 different pharmaceuticals that were tested for, including in rural areas. Note that there are detectable levels across all media, and that the most biologically concerning contaminants, hormones, and antidepressants were also the most frequently detected. These chemicals have been shown to affect biota at even incredibly low environmental levels. And ultimately, impacts to subsistence landscapes by contaminants are an environmental justice issue. This is true in Grand Portage, in Keweenaw Bay, and throughout the basin. So back to Keweenaw Bay, our past work provided the foundation for our current research landscape, and there's quite a bit going on, and so I'll say a little bit about some of those projects now. And it's also important to note that research partnerships with tribal, Métis, and First Nations, it really is a long-term commitment. The partnership just doesn't cease based on a project end date. So we are currently leading efforts, and by we, I mean Evelyn and I, with KBIC and Glyphwick to compile their existing data sets to create a KBIC knowledge inventory and a guidance document for working with Indigenous knowledge. Now, this guide will be specific to Keweenaw Bay, and it's also going to be used to inform updates to the tribe's integrated resource management plan, the creation of a climate resiliency plan, and also a landscape-based ethnographic overview and assessment. We are also working with a team of engineers on a research experiences for undergraduates program, where students are partnering with KBIC Natural Resources staff to work on community research priorities. And this includes some natural lighting and energy efficiency for their fish hatchery, some research on heavy metal impacts to manumin or wild rice, and also a number of other projects related to environmental sensors and monitoring. This is really important to note because according to Jim Thanum, a longtime staff member at Glyphwick, engineers are a priority expertise needed in tribal nations throughout the region. In January, we began work on a new NSF project, leading a convergence research team with KBIC and Glyphwick, focused on the development of a tribal landscape system model. We're also engaged in energy sovereignty research with KBIC, Sioux Tribe, and Saginaw Chippewa Band, as well as other communities and universities across Michigan. And the team is investigating risks, barriers, and opportunities that are associated with energy transitions in different kinds of communities and landscapes. And finally, we are partnered with the Intertribal Ag Council and other Indigenous scholars from Northern Michigan University and Ferris State to host the Food Sovereignty Symposium this fall. And here is the website right here, and I'll also make my slides available to the organizers to share with you. But registration for virtual and in-person participation, we hope to have that registration open next week. So I wanted to share just a bit more about our approach for the development of the tribal landscape system, which has been informed by KBIC as well as our Glyphwick partners. Our objectives for this research: first, we are going to be mapping spatial and temporal variation of tribal landscape system contamination, climate-related changes, and Ojibwa's socio-ecological values and practices. We also want to highlight Ojibwa ethics and community decision-making, and also evaluate the creation of the tribal landscape system, the process of research, design, and practice in equitable ways. So 2 primary maps are going to be created. One map will be for contaminant levels to identify high, moderate, and low concentration levels in inland lakes, and another map for social relationships and practices across the landscape. And these include the practices affected by climate-related changes, like ice cover, for example. So then those 2 maps are going to be overlaid to determine high, moderate, and low risk areas due to toxics, and the areas that are increasingly affected by climate. And this is our elementary foundation of the tribal landscape system to develop a more comprehensive model. And so I know this is a really busy graphic, so I'll take some time just to explain some of these elements here. So first, this work is taking place within the Keweenaw Bay Indian Community Harvesting Area, included in the ceded territory established by the 1842 treaty. So notice the bridge here to indicate the different investigators' knowledge systems and expertise between Michigan TEK, KBIC, and Glyphwick, and each having different social systems and histories, and also different ideas of well-being, ethics, and having different landscape practices. Now, this work is concerned with the external forcings of mercury and PCBs and climate-related changes. And as we know, these elements create various impacts to the landscape and within the landscape, and they affect the harvesting practices of KBIC. Mercury and PCBs are not evenly distributed in the water bodies or the fish. So we are going to be using state, federal, and tribal data inventories of contaminant levels in fish. And also Glyphwick has archived fish tissue samples stemming back from about 1982. But those samples have primarily been tested for mercury only. And our project group will be testing for PCB levels and also start providing analysis for combined toxicity of both mercury and PCBs. This work is designed drawing from Albert Marshall's work on two-eyed seeing. KBIC and Glyphwick were a part of the research design, and we are using research approaches that are relevant to the KBIC. The tribal landscape system will be created in a series of community workshops to ensure it accurately reflects the ways the landscape is viewed and valued by the tribe. Additionally, there are many students working as part of the project. Evelyn and I recently worked with Emily Shaw, an environmental engineering PhD candidate at Michigan Tech, to create a guide for research partnerships with as the Keweenaw Bay Indian community. The guide is in the form of a trifold, and it is available for download on the KBIC website. And then finally, our partnership and our bridging process is being evaluated. Although our partnership has been built and has really strengthened together as we work together for more than a decade, we know that we still have a lot more to learn about knowledge equity. So this leads me to close with a prelude. Like I had mentioned before, today is a prelude of what I think is to come. Like many of you likely on this call, I've been thinking a lot on the future of bridging knowledge systems in science, governance, and education. And as a society, I believe our social consciousness is changing. I sense that I'm in the midst of significant moments that are transforming our beliefs and values, and also what we consider to be normal. So I wanted to share just a few examples. In the sciences, the concept and application of two-eyed seeing has really broadened its reach across other groups. The Wildlife Society, NASA, and across many disciplines in academia. So as many of you know, bridging was a primary theme for the conference in May, the International Association for Great Lakes Research. And last year, that conference, there was one paper in the final session of the conference that focused on traditional ecological knowledge in the Great Lakes Basin. And this past May, the session Bridging Knowledge Systems spanned 3 days of the conference. We've also seen a rise in court cases concerning the legal personhood of water bodies and other plant and animal beings. And they're really leveraging the precedent that's been set by the legal personhood granted to corporations. So the citizens of Ohio are aiming for legal personhood for Lake Erie. And this is also taking place in other parts of the country too, in Minnesota and California, Canada. There are also cases in Ecuador and New Zealand. And in some of these places, everyday citizens are doing this work. And finally, we'd like to remind everyone of the recent precedent in governance. It has actually been less than 100 days since Deborah Holland, a member of the Pueblo of Laguna, was sworn in as the 54th Secretary of the Department of the Interior. This means that in our country's entire history, it's only been 3 months and a day that a descendant of the original peoples, stewards, and knowledge keepers has overseen its lands, species, natural resources, and Indian peoples. And more importantly, it has only been 93 days that an Indigenous person has overseen the government-to-government relations between American Indian people and the United States. So yes, we have reason to celebrate, but more importantly, it's really an acknowledgement that we have so much more work to do. And there are other transformations taking place that will continue to open new doors for questions concerning bridging knowledge systems, such as addressing the role of tribal and First Nations and Métis nations as research partners instead of research subjects, and increased attention to shared decision-making, Indigenous research autonomy and data sovereignty, and really the many implications for research and education moving forward. So, of course, there is a lot of work to do, but it's really, it could not be a more exciting time to be a part of the Bridging Knowledge Systems community. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I think if I'm understanding our preparation for today, we'll move on to the next presentations, and then Seth and Evelyn will participate in the questions. Is that right? Yeah, great. Okay, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. Now I will turn it over to Heather Patterson and JC Chiblo.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm Heather Patterson, as was alluded to in the intro. I am a master's student at the University of Guelph in Ontario. It's on the traditional territory of several Indigenous peoples, including the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation and the Attawadron people. But today I come to you from the traditional territory of the Atikameksheng and Anishinaabe in Northern Ontario, the region where I was born and raised and developed my love and passion for forestry and the environment as a whole. I'd also like to introduce some of my other co-authors on this work who unfortunately are not here today, but Dr. Ella Bowles is a postdoctoral student at University of British Columbia. She's originally from Kelowna, and she's partnered with the WISE Lab, which is at the University of Guelph, which is what I'm under. Dr. Deborah McGregor is an associate professor and Canada Research Chair at the Indigenous Environmental Justice at Osgoode Law School at York University. Dr. Sue Chiblo is from Garden River First Nation and an assistant professor in the School of Environmental Science at Guelph. And finally, Dr. Jessie Popp is a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Science and an associate professor at the University of Guelph and my supervisor for this work. So today I'm going to talk to you about glyphosate-based herbicides used in forestry and how we wove Indigenous knowledge and Western science to try to acknowledge concerns and really address what knowledge is there and identify knowledge gaps. So I'll start with a bit of a primer on what is glyphosate. So glyphosate is a broad spectrum herbicide that's used in both agriculture and forestry, and it's often cited as being the most commonly used herbicide worldwide. Essentially, it functions by blocking a key cellular pathway in plants and some microorganisms, which leads to an inability to grow and ultimately death. The absence of this pathway in vertebrates such as mammals, birds, and fish is often touted as evidence of glyphosate's relative safety for exposure for these organisms, but there's contrasting evidence from various studies and reviews regarding the impacts on ecosystem functionality and wildlife. Additionally, concerns about human health are hotly debated and contentious in academia, the public sector, and amongst international regulators. So that brings us to the question of, if glyphosate kills plants, why are we using it in forestry? Isn't the point to grow trees? So essentially, when trees are cut in a commercial forestry operation, many plants take hold in the newly disturbed area, including both deciduous plants such as aspen and raspberry, as well as coniferous plants such as pine and spruce. So forest managers spray these areas with glyphosate in an effort to eliminate a lot of the deciduous vegetation, which can often shadow and outcompete the coniferous vegetation, which allows the coniferous vegetation to grow and ultimately dominate the stand, which makes the stand more economically favorable for harvest in the future. Glyphosate is very effective at doing this, and because of this, glyphosate was the herbicide of choice on almost 95% of all forestry areas treated with herbicide between 1990 and 2016 in Ontario. So many groups are opposed to the use of glyphosate in forestry, including Stop the Spray BC, Stop Spraying New Brunswick, and more locally, the TEK Elders Group, who has been fighting to get a moratorium on herbicide spraying in forestry, which we are lucky enough to have JC Chiblo here to speak more to their work during the Q&A session. But their concerns, as well as the concerns of other community members, really prompted the creation of this project. So the project goals were to first and foremost weave Indigenous and Western knowledge to identify concerns of community members regarding the use of glyphosate in forestry. Second, to summarize documented impacts in both knowledge systems about glyphosate-based herbicides in forest ecosystems. Third, to identify knowledge gaps that exist, and four, to inform future research via these knowledge gaps. So to do this, we hosted a workshop in partnership with Magnetawan First Nation titled Connecting Guardians in a Changing World. It was hosted in November 2019, so luckily we were able to do it in person. We invited representatives from each lands department, elders, and youth. The workshop consisted of 2 days of semi-structured group interviews that focused on climate change and herbicide use in forestry, respectively. Ultimately, we had members from 12 First Nations that attended. Other groups such as the Toronto Zoo, the Anishinaabe Ontario Fisheries Resource Centre, and the Georgian Bay Biosphere Reserve also attended our workshop and contributed knowledge. And here we have a map of the 12 First Nations that participated. So in January of 2021, we conducted a results sharing workshop to confirm the validity of our conclusions and methods. Prior to the workshop, we distributed PDF copies of the community report to all participants who provided an email address, but this was optional, so not all participants did provide an email address. But we also distributed paper copies to the TEK Elders Group sometime in the autumn of 2020. And that led to our ultimate virtual results sharing session where we had a PowerPoint, explained our results, and asked for feedback from all the people who participated and anyone else who wanted to join about whether we really represented our participants' concerns and viewpoints, and whether we really did things in a good way, and whether people approved of how we conducted our research. We received overwhelmingly positive feedback, and it has since been shared at several conferences, including now this one, where I'm lucky enough to be able to share some of our results with you today. So from the workshop, we were able to identify 5 really main key concerns that people had with regards to glyphosate spraying in forestry. So the first was plant biodiversity and health. The second was animal biodiversity and health. The third was movement through the environment and its persistence in the environment. The fourth was human safety and well-being. And finally, the fifth was awareness and transparency amongst government, communities, the general public, and industry. So to go over our first key concern, which is plant biodiversity and health, one quote from the workshop said, "The elders say that if it hurts one blade of grass, you can't use it." So when we researched in Western science, we found that shifts in community composition following application vary in how drastic and long-term they've been documented. Generally, as is intended, forests become more conifer dominated. Even though species richness and diversity might remain stable, or in some cases even increase due to invasive or opportunistic species taking hold in these disturbed sites, these species might not perform the same ecosystem functions, and so therefore examinations of species richness and diversity may not accurately reflect impacts to ecosystem functionality. We also looked into some plant species of interest that participants specifically noted. So through the Anishinaabe worldview, no species is seen as being more important than another, and each species plays a unique role in the ecosystem. But certain plant species are used more by Indigenous peoples for ceremonial and food purposes. So of particular concern that the participants noted during the workshop were impacts on berry-bearing plants, paper birch, and eastern white cedar. So we have another quote from the workshop: "How much can our plants and trees take? Yes, they are very resilient, and yes, they find their own ways, but how much can they take before it's too much for them?" So this brings us to our second key concern, animal biodiversity and health. So I've split this into 5 categories as a way to simplify it. So we'll start with insects and pollinators. So one of our quotes, very poignant, very to the point, it kills all the pollinators. Glyphosate kills all the pollinators. So the effects of glyphosate on bee species have been documented to include acute toxicity, reduced brood survival and larval weights, as well as changes in microbiota in the gut, which can impact pathogen susceptibility in these insects. Industry-funded studies we found often reported no adverse effects, but all studies that described any negative effect of glyphosate exposure to insect pollinators cite potential impacts on overall colony survival and success. Impacts on other insect pollinator species other than commercial honeybees, domestic honeybees are seldom examined and are mainly speculative, based mostly on habitat structure. So for example, if you're examining monarch butterflies, they'll look at the impact of glyphosate on milkweed and then infer what the impact on monarch butterflies would be, but there are no studies we were able to find that tested the direct toxicity. Our next category was birds. So no studies were found that tested the direct toxicity of glyphosate on birds. Glyphosate can cause reductions in the structural complexity of habitats, and this can have different effects on bird species depending on their unique requirements. So bird species which favor more simple coniferous habitats are generally expected to thrive or at least survive, while those which depend on deciduous plants either directly or indirectly may be more challenged. Therefore, glyphosate can cause drastic shifts in bird community composition, and similar to what we saw with plants, even though you might have the same richness, it may not have the same ecosystem functionality. Amphibians and reptiles were also a concern for participants. So one quote said, "I have to imagine that anything being sprayed on an animal who breathes through its skin is just not good." So as many of us know, amphibians are vulnerable to many environmental toxins due to the permeability of their skin, and they're often a study animal in looking at environmental toxins. Varying degrees of toxicity have been observed in amphibians depending on which herbicide formulation was used, because herbicides are not just glyphosate, they're also mixed with other chemicals in order to help penetrate plant tissues. Also dependent on the species that's examined, the life stage of said species, and the environmental conditions such as the pH of the water, how much sediment's in the water, the temperature of the water, and the exposure level. In other words, how much herbicide they were exposed to. There's very limited research about the impact of glyphosate on reptiles. We were only able to find one study that examined freshwater turtles, and they essentially were not able to translate their findings into what they expect to be real life conditions. They found adverse effects at very, very high levels, but not levels that they would expect to see in the wild. So fish, very few studies focus on fish in temperate freshwater environments. Most of the studies that do exist focus on more tropical, warm water environments. One study we found did note that ecological conditions may play a role in toxicity and may actually make temperate species less sensitive to glyphosate when compared to tropical fish. But negative effects from glyphosate exposure have been observed in fish, but the magnitude and duration of these effects vary widely between studies. So no studies were found examining the direct toxicity of glyphosate to wild small mammal populations, but several studies have been conducted on domestic mammals, mainly mice and rats in laboratory settings. And so in laboratory settings, glyphosate has been shown to cause toxicity and neurobehavioral changes, carcinogenicity, so cancer causing, and endocrine disruption, which can lead to really adverse reproductive effects. But the results of these studies are very hotly debated. Of particular concern for a lot of participants is ungulates, so your moose, your deer. So we have a quote that says, "We haven't looked into it, whether the spraying of herbicides is causing observed impacts in deer, but we're saying it definitely could be a huge factor." So participants noted changes in the health of white-tailed deer and moose that were harvested, including white spots on the liver, abnormal growth, reduced reproduction, and hermaphroditism. And this at sometimes made the meat unedible, according to participants. But no studies were found that directly examined the impacts of glyphosate on ungulate health. But the studies on small mammals do support some of the assertions of participants. So another quote, you also have all the effect of different levels of plant growth and sort of a structure to all those sapling trees that the moose rely on or the deer. So those would all be gone too. It's sort of affecting all the wildlife and the food chain, the food cycle. So glyphosate does significantly reduce browse for deer and moose for several years post-treatment, and some species of deer do not avoid browse that has been sprayed with glyphosate-based herbicides. The impacts of glyphosate on white-tailed deer are less studied than moose, but most of the studies that do exist generally tend to correlate, but no studies were found looking at the impacts of glyphosate on elk and other ungulates that could exist within this region. Another community quote said, bears are all coming to the community because there's nothing left to eat up in the bush. So again, we found no studies that directly examine the impacts on habitat or health of omnivorous or carnivorous mammals. But one study did speculate that reduced food abundance as a result of glyphosate application, such as if it's killing off all the berry trees or killing the small mammals, could adversely impact omnivore and carnivore populations. But it hasn't been studied directly. In terms of total ecosystem impacts, as you may have gleaned from my summary, the research has consistently shown that more generalist species are likely to survive and may thrive in areas that have been logged or treated with glyphosate, but animals that rely on other species whose populations suffer from glyphosate-based herbicides may in turn be impacted negatively. As noted by participants, Western science should really view animals and ecosystems in a more interconnected way, rather than segmenting it into groups or having a really narrow focus, which really limits the use of the study. And we must consider the indirect effects on other taxa and really consider cascading impacts within the environment. So this brings us to our next key concern, which is movement through the environment and persistence within the environment. So another quote from the workshop, they spray it during the dry season, but then if it rains and it gets picked up by water, there's no point. It doesn't matter when you spray because it's all going to be moved. So significant amounts of glyphosate can wash off of foliage if there is rain soon after application, and glyphosate can leach from soils for up to 4 months after application, though leaching is highest in the days immediately following application. However, detection rates in lakes, ponds, and wetlands tend to be lower than in rivers, streams, and drainage ditches, likely because glyphosate really tends to bind to organic materials. And if it binds to organic materials in really slow moving water, it can settle out of the water column. So it's just not detected in these samples. So another concern was really drift. So another quote, somewhere along the line where they're spraying herbicides, it's blowing elsewhere. So drift can cause unintended plant death and injury to organisms outside of the targeted spray zone. Buffer zones are required by Health Canada to mitigate potential risks to non-target organisms from drift, but participants often expressed that this concern that this wasn't sufficient or that the rules weren't being really strictly adhered to and that there was still impacts from drift outside of the target zone. Another really big concern was bioaccumulation. So quote, we talk about this stuff, spraying of herbicides that's happening, how it affects the food chain. The food chain goes all the way up to us. And when you affect the chain somewhere between, it breaks the whole cycle. So we weren't able to find any studies that documented the dietary exposures of people who rely on wild forage. Health Canada has done a study that concluded that the dietary exposures to the general public from agricultural crops and drinking water were not of concern to human health. We believe that concentrations in wild food sources would likely be similar, as they use similar herbicide application rates in forestry, and they also spray less often than they do in agriculture, but it hasn't actually been studied directly. Glyphosate is also not thought to really be stored by vegetation in the long term, and it doesn't bioaccumulate in animals, so it poses a generally low risk to humans eating wild forage, fish, and game that was exposed to the herbicide. So our fourth key concern was human safety and well-being. So the toxicity and risk to human health posed by glyphosate and its various herbicide formulations is a concern to the general public, including Indigenous communities, as I stated in the beginning of my presentation. Human health risk assessments have been conducted on glyphosate and or its formulations by several academic researchers and various regulatory agencies, but the results are really varied. So conclusions can range from linking glyphosate with cancers such as non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which was one connection that was made by the World Health Organization, to claiming no ill effects at all and that it's essentially inert and does not impact physical health in humans. But one aspect that is often really overlooked in a lot of studies looking at the impact of environmental toxins is the impact on mental health and cultural well-being. So really any industry can have an impact on mental and social well-being, and the well-being of Indigenous peoples relies directly on the health and well-being of the environment. So a quote from the workshop says, "As much as I could learn from this book, it doesn't mean anything if I don't know about my own land." Knowledge transfer is inhibited, if not entirely stopped, by these alterations to the ecosystem, which prevent the execution of traditional practices and really adversely impact communities, their mental and spiritual health, and their cultural well-being. So our final key concern is awareness and transparency amongst government, academia, and communities. So one major barrier to understanding and really communicating a lot of the impacts of glyphosate-based herbicides is distrust in existing academic research. It was a very common theme in our workshop participants, like what they said. But we found that it mainly stemmed from a lack of consensus from the academic community and governing bodies. So if they can't agree, how are we supposed to know what the real answer is? And real or perceived conflicts of interest, particularly around industry-based studies. So research that's conducted independent from industry or special interest groups is really essential to overcoming this barrier so people can really trust the information that they're getting. And several participants cited concerns that government and industry prioritize economy over ecology when making decisions regarding forest management. So our final conclusions and future research directions, we were able to identify 3 main gaps in knowledge. The first being research on the toxicity of glyphosate to plants and animals of the Great Lakes region of northeastern Ontario. These studies generally lack, and real focus on the direct toxicity is really key. The indirect effects of glyphosate on ecosystems and their cascading impacts on other taxa are generally not studied or are just kind of inferred from the results of really focused studies. And finally, research incorporating the interconnectedness of the environment, including humans therein, and using a holistic approach is really, really lacking in the current body of literature in Western science. So our ultimate conclusions are that the environmental and sociocultural impacts of glyphosate are vast and complex. There are several key areas that are lacking in Western science, and Indigenous and Western knowledge systems can really address issues in a holistic way that considers the interconnectedness of the environment and humans, and inclusive approaches that value multiple ways of knowing can successfully address these long-standing environmental issues. Just as an acknowledgement, I would really like to express our thanks to all the community members from the 12 communities who shared their knowledge with us, and specifically Magnetawan First Nation for hosting the Connecting Guardians in a Changing World workshop. And I'd also like to thank our university project partners and affiliates for their support. So the funding for the project was provided from the Indigenous Community-Based Climate Monitoring Program through Magnetawan First Nation and the New Frontiers in Research Fund and the National Sciences and Engineering Research Council. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Heather. Okay. I'm getting questions coming in. So if you have questions for the presenters and their panelist members, it would be good to type it in the Q&A box. I think to start off real quick, I'm going to ask just a brief question to Heather that came through. And the question was, in agricultural systems, glyphosate is causing some resistance or plants to become resistant to it. Are you seeing that in the forests at all?
There are some studies. Most of the studies don't focus on forestry in general, which was kind of a struggle with finding articles to look at. But from my reading, there are plants that it can control that have been studied, mostly in the context of the company that makes it is studying what it's effective against. So we're having some issues, I think, around raspberries are kind of getting a little bit of resistance, but it really, forests are not as heavily sprayed or as frequently sprayed as agricultural systems. So I don't think it's as much of a concern at this point. But again, it wasn't really a focus of the research. It's just what I'm remembering from some of the articles that I read, but most of them are in a really agricultural context.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask maybe if everyone on the panel could unmute their cameras so that we can see you. And maybe some of the folks that didn't do the actual presenting could take the first answer for this one. But I really liked Val's discussion of this bridge. And one of the things that she said that this bridge can help forming these partnerships, these collaborations, and thinking about bridge as a metaphor, that this bridge can help maintain the integrity of tribal and non-tribal knowledge systems. I wonder if you could explore that a little bit, and how do these partnerships kind of help maintain integrity of knowledge and produce new knowledge as well?
So that question is for me.
I was thinking that the other presenters could
Mhm.
try to answer it, but you can start if you'd like.
Yeah, I would be curious about what others said as well, because those bridges are different in different places.
So I guess I'll start out with this then. One of the things I was thinking of is that a relationship building really starts at the very beginning of any partnership. The mutual respect, I believe Val shared shared the document that we've just been working on, a guidance for research partnerships. And that's what we're really seeing as the beginning, is respect for each other, and where our knowledge comes from, and knowing that it isn't taken piecemeal, I guess. That's why we have this partnership. So that's what I would say is a really important part of it. And Seth, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what I would add is the integration of what we now call, Western science with TEK is vital. And, some of the things we're working on with some of the collaborations that I'm doing is incorporating Ojibwa worldview into peer-reviewed literature. How often do you see Ojibwa names of species in peer-reviewed literature? So that's one of the things that we're doing. And then on the flip side of that, the importance of Western science to maintaining a subsistence lifestyle in Ojibwa culture is vital as well, with regards to risk of toxicity from either mercury loadings or pharmaceuticals that might affect the behaviors of biota. I think there's a mutualistic value between what we now call Western science and TEK, and that's where I like to see how these collaborations are going and growing. And I have to say, I just want to comment to both you and Val that I really love the pamphlet that you guys put together. It just really encapsulates what an academic and tribal collaboration should look like, and it does so in a really aesthetically pleasing and comprehensive manner.
Thank you. JC, did you want to add into this?
Was this the last question? Sorry, I'm just catching up here. Okay.
Maybe, yeah.
I would just say, when I see this kind of question, I think of the research that Heather and her colleagues did with the communities in my territory, and I really saw some really great work there. And I would say that the way that they conducted themselves with community was very ethical, and they did it from an Indigenous perspective and approach with their partners. So within the research and within the workshop, they included things like ceremony. They allowed us to have that space that we needed and opened it in a good way. And again, the way that they reported back to us by, send us your email if you want to review this research. And if there's anything wrong with it, you can say that, you can communicate that. And I think that in itself is the way that research should be done. As the people that, I was at that workshop, I'm not saying that I'm the one that holds that knowledge, but as a community, to be able to review that knowledge and make sure that it's being accurately represented in academia is so important in a way that feels good to us. So, they really made sure that they did the reporting back and checking in with community members. And I think that that's the way that scientific research should be done if you're working in a partnership with Indigenous folks.
Wonderful. I don't know if anyone else wants to add into this question about the integrity of the knowledge systems by engaging in these partnerships. Otherwise, I can move to the next several questions.
I think I would like to add to that and just say that humility is critical. when we're thinking about maintaining integrity of knowledge systems, the humility of people to recognize that they don't know everything and they can't see it from all different perspectives, that other people have insights and knowledge and skills that you don't hold. It's incredible to me to think about an independent researcher at all. Like, how in the world can you see these issues and really resolve things from one perspective? It's a little bit beyond me about, how that was. Why do people even do that? I don't know. I've never worked on my own. Everything has been in partnership with others. So humility, like, yeah, when I first started working within KBIC, I didn't know crap. Like, there's no, I mean, and as researchers, we are supposed to be seeking answers to questions that we don't know the answers. So it's kind of interesting to me about how some academics may, of course, they know what they know, but yeah, humility and being accepting of other knowledge is just really critical in this interconnected problems and issues.
Excellent. Thank you for the questions that are coming in. We have quite a few, so I will apologize in advance if we can't get to all of them, but they're important, and here we go. So the next question, I think, Val, you kind of got me on this topic here, and I was going to maybe save this one for the end, but I think I'll do it now. This is for all of you, if you want to answer. How is your work on these partnerships, either from the university perspective or from the indigenous perspective or from working for tribal communities, how is how these partnerships changed your own practice, research, and understandings of the world?
Well, I'll jump in since nobody's speaking. I'll be honest, when we began looking at pharmaceuticals in the environment, it was not at all within my area of expertise. It still really isn't. And it honestly wasn't a high level of concern to me. But the more that I've learned over time in terms of risks to biota and in terms of risks to humans who are consuming these biota, I am absolutely fascinated by this. It has become a major research theme, and it's because of these partnerships working. I worked for the tribe itself, but also working with academia, that we were able to discover these different relationships and what actually exists.
I would say that one of the changes that it's made for me is looking how global effects affect our region. I really had no idea before with the ASAP project that what is happening in China would have an effect over here in our Great Lakes fishery.
I think for me, the partnership and thinking how has changed my own perspective is beyond just work, right? So really being taught to see and listen and sense different things that, what we know really or don't know really has an impact on what we can see and hear, and so my perspectives have been widened, my understandings have been deepened, and lots of interconnections, not just in space but also through time as well.
Okay, thank you. So the next question, I'm going to get to the regulatory. This was another one from the audience. And I think anyone can answer this one as well. The question is, how do you imagine regulatory agencies absorbing this information and using it in their decision-making process? And then do you think academia is the bridge for this? And what other potential bridges do you see?
I'd like to start with this one. I think it was mentioned before that I've been working with the TEK Elders Group, which stands for the Traditional Ecological Knowledge Elders Group from the Robinson Huron Treaty Territory. Very large group, and what they've been doing is they've been advocating to government agencies on how this is not something that they want in their community, that they don't give their free, prior, and informed consent, and that engagement is not being done in a way that they feel is comfortable or accurate or done well. And they're asking for a complete stoppage of this aerial herbicide spraying. What's happened though for them in their experiences is basically they've been going to one, and let's say it was Health Canada, they said, oh, well, you know, technically the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, or whatever they're called now, is the one that's giving the permits. So they would start lobbying with that side of the government, and they would push them back and saying, well, Health Canada is the one that approves it for us to use it. So the TEK elders basically experienced the runaround. And I would say that ideally, it would be great to start using it in their decision-making process, but from the experience that they've had is that it just didn't go that way. So I just felt like that was important to note. Ideally, I think academia can be very helpful for bridging that, because as we can see from the research that has been talked about already, that is starting to happen. And I think that the government agencies just need to catch up a little bit.
Could I jump in on this one too? Yeah. I think this is a fantastic question, and I agree that this is starting to happen. And to be honest, you know, next week I'm giving a full presentation on some of the pharmaceuticals that we found in sediments, waters, and fish tissues to a group that works closely with legislators that develop policy on regulation of pollutants. And this comes from doing this research. It comes from publishing this research. It comes from presenting to the state agencies like the Minnesota Pollution Control on these findings, and just expressing constantly the importance of this to a subsistence lifestyle, whether it's through risks to populations of the fish species and the biota themselves, or risks to the humans that consume them. But you know, we have a job as both scientists and as tribal employees to advocate for the people who are our constituents, and let people know what these risks are. And then ultimately policy may follow. It may not, but we can certainly try to make that happen.
Yeah, I'd like to add to what Seth just said, and it's really critical for me. As part of my work, I feel responsible and obligated to work on KBIC priorities and provide KBIC with the research that they need, with the documentation that they need. And KBIC is kind of interesting about regulatory agencies, right? Because ultimately many tribal nations are having their own agencies, and also KBIC has gained treatment as a state or treatment as a sovereign authority for air and water. And so these partnerships are critical to give the tribes as much support and evidence as possible, so they can push that as a regulatory body. So yeah, it's early on. Again, I think this is a prelude. KBIC is the first tribe in Michigan, and there's other tribes in Minnesota, Wisconsin. And yeah, I just think this is going to grow in an area that it's to not just be dependent on federal and state agencies, but also just help provide tribes with what they need. And so they can act in the way that benefits and protects their communities, a people, landscape, all parts of their communities.
And so I would like to just add a little bit more to that. So one of the things that, like we talked a little bit earlier about research questions, and a lot of times we don't have the expertise in-house, but we have the questions from the community. And that's been really, really helpful to have academia working in partnership with us to get that, or to answer those questions that inform policy or recommendations for policy. And that's what we've been dependent on that for, or for several different questions we've had, such as why is the air quality standards not protective of the community? Or what is going on with fish consumption advisories? What can we do with that for standard or water quality standards?
Just to support Evelyn's view, one of the things I learned relatively early in my career working for a tribe is it is not just our job to present unbiased information. It is actually our job to present unbiased information and our professional judgment and our professional recommendations. And what I've noticed over the course of my career is that many folks in the state and federal agencies don't feel at liberty to express, or even academia, to express their professional opinions. They only want to express their unbiased findings, and that's not sufficient in this professional world, in my opinion.
I
Yeah.
could probably go on and on and on about bias and unbiased. Like there's no such thing as being unbiased, period. From the questions we ask, from the approaches that we adopt and use, and what we consider to be valuable to restore and to protect. So yeah, and that's why it's so critical to get tribes at the beginning of research design to ask their questions. Like that, the one project, the CNH ASEPS project that we were working on, when can we eat the fish? That was not the question from the research team. They wanted to develop some cost benefit, economic impact, of toxics related to work days or additional deaths and all of these kinds of things. But when can we eat the fish? That completely changed the trajectory of the work, and it's forward looking and it's hope, and it's much different kind of question, which shows that our questions are already biased as researchers.
I'll echo some of this with some of my own experiences working with tribes here in the Great Lakes, and the treaty organizations in particular, and some of the partnerships we're involved in. The tribes and treaty organizations have been very upfront about wanting to have information that can be legible to the state, right? So counting fish, counting trees, et cetera, to show how, from the wildlife biology, fisheries biology perspective, how those tribal uses and management are actually impacting, rather than just having, which was happening before, is having the state say, well, you're degrading this resource, so we have to put limits on you. With the biologists, with that kind of science that's legible within the state context, it's defensible in court. It makes it easier to work with the DNRs, the state and federal wildlife folks, et cetera. So this is great. Thank you all. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and maybe this will sound like a strange question, but for me, it bridges sort of the water and land that we've been hearing about from both of the projects, and it has to do with invasive species. So there was a question about how do tribal communities think about invasive species and their targeted removal, sometimes maybe with herbicides, or I'm not sure what the equivalent is in the water that might be used, but basically using some of these chemicals for ecosystem restoration. And how do tribal communities think about invasive species, I guess?
I know for our tribe, we do manual removal of invasive plant species. We have a pesticide ban essentially, so we've chosen to not use them.
And our tribe as well, we concentrate on manual removal, but we're going with, we're protecting native species. We're not talking about eradication of another species, because the Plant Nation has its own agenda and own rights. And we don't know everything about the Plant Nation. So sometimes there's a non-native species there and it's there for a reason. Such as, for instance, Phragmites, which is called by many a strong warrior plant. And it has a duty to protect the wetlands that's nearby, but sometimes they go beyond that. So that's where we step in a little bit and we might help those native species that are there.
I would agree. Obviously, I can't speak for all tribes because I also really believe in self-determination and allowing them to make those decisions that work best for their community. However, I do agree with Evelyn. You know, I've heard some very conflicting views on invasive species from community members, and some of them are, yes, it's a gift. You know, this plant coming in is going to teach us something. And like Evelyn gave us a great example, is that it can teach us something, and there are sometimes positive benefits to it. However, I've also heard folks in other communities kind of saying that we need to remove them and that they are a threat to our natural species that we use for community purposes. So it can be that question. It really depends, I guess, on the community and who you ask. But again, I think it's important to just reiterate that self-determination when it comes to these kinds of things is so important. Allowing the community to decide how they deal with these species and what kind of benefits, if they are beneficial to that community, should be up to them and decided by them.
That was perfectly said, Jace. And I just want to, going back to that biased, in the terminology, there's already a bias with invasive species. They're talked about as threats, and non-native, like what they're not instead of what they are. And so there's already a lot of biases in even the names that we give them.
Yeah, I would really like to echo exactly what JC said. From my experience being at the workshop and hearing what people had to say, like I said, I completely agree with what JC said, but what was really interesting to me when I was at the workshop is the topic of invasive species did come up quite frequently. And in fact, it wasn't just the use of herbicides that people, because it was an unstructured interview, right? So everyone can talk about wherever the conversation goes, that's where it goes. And we had a lot of discussion actually about lampricide as well, and communities being concerned about lampricide being released down their rivers and the environmental devastation that they were seeing as a result. But there was a lot of talk about government really coming to communities in a really transparent and holistic way, and how that was appreciated over doing things in secret and things being all sneaky. But there was also a lot of really interesting approaches, as like JC said, like this is a gift. So in the example of Phragmites, is there a way that we could use this in like weaving? Could it be used as another food source? I don't know if Phragmites can in particular, but can these things be used in different ways? But also even using it as a way or a reason or a tool to engage youth. So if we don't want to use herbicides to control Phragmites or purple loosestrife or what have you, can we get some sort of youth engagement program where people are going and manually pulling it, and it gives youth an engagement with the community and a real connection and an opportunity to be on the land and to help their community, and for everyone to kind of come together and make it a really beautiful thing instead of something that most people would consider negative. So I just thought that was really interesting from what I heard at the workshop.
I thought it was interesting that you brought up purple loosestrife too, because that was one that we heard stories in our area about. Purple loosestrife was actually brought over from Europe. Homesteaders brought it over because it was a common medicine that was safe for babies even. And that's how it made its way over here to begin with. So for some species, it just takes a very long time for us to make that connection and for it to be part of our traditions and culture.
Thank you all so much, Chi-Miigwech. I'm going to turn it over to Jessica Koski to kind of wrap up and talk about next week.
Yep, Team Miigwech, thank you to all of our presenters and panelists today, Val, Evelyn, Seth, Heather, and JC. This has really been an informative, enlightening, and inspiring session. And so thank you for speaking and for sharing your insights and perspectives with all of us today. Thank you also to Mike and Jessica Dolan for Q&A facilitation and support, and Christina with the University of Minnesota running the Zoom for us today. The next session next week will be Restoring Culture and Seed Knowledge through Native Plant Restoration. Speakers will include Sherilyn Johnston with the Aamjiwnaang First Nation, Satiokwa Bucktooth with the St. Regis Mohawk Tribe, and a third guest speaker that is to be confirmed, likely to speak on TEK and Monoman wild rice restoration. Our final session will be the week after on June 30th. And as a heads up, it will run a little longer than the first 5 sessions. We're planning to use 2 hours for the session to feature TEK and monitoring initiatives and climate adaptation. And this will also include our closing address for the series. So at this point, we will conclude our 4th session of the TEK speaker series. Miigwech, thank you for attending today, and we'll see you all next week.